Glory be to the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dearly beloved ones, today we shall be dealing with St. John chapter 18, verses 28 through chapter 19, verse 16. We have looked at the main personalities in the trial of Jesus, the Jews with their hatred, Pilate with his haunting past, and Jesus in the serenity of his regal majesty. But certain other people were on the outskirts of the scene. Firstly, there were the soldiers. When Jesus was given into their hands to be scourged, they amused themselves with their crude horseplay. He was a king. Well, then let him have a robe and a crown. So they put on an old purple robe on him and a crown of thorns around his brow. And they slapped him on the face. They were playing a game that ancient people commonly played. And yet, all of the people involved in the trial of Jesus, the soldiers were least to blame, for they did not know what they were doing. Most likely, they had come up from Caesarea and did not know what was all about. Jesus to them was only a chance criminal. Here is another example of the dramatic irony used by St. John. The soldiers made a caricature of Jesus as king, while in actual fact we know he was the only king. Beneath the jest, there was eternal truth. There is yet another person which we should discuss about in this scene, which is none other than Barabbas, whose episode John tells very briefly indeed. Of the custom of freeing a prisoner at Passover, we know nothing more than the Gospel tell us. The other Gospels, to some extent, fill out John's brief picture. And when we put all our information together, we find that Barabbas was a notable prisoner, a brigand who had taken part in a certain insurrection in the city and had committed murder. The name Barabbas is interesting. There are two possibilities as to its derivation. It may be compounded of the Hebrew bar and abba, which would mean son of the father, or it may be compounded of bar rabban, which would mean son of the rabbi. It is not impossible that Barabbas was the son of some rabbi, and it may well be that criminal though he was popular with the people as a kind of Robin Hood character. It is certainly true that we must not think of Barabbas as a sneak thief or a petty pilferer or a burglar. He was in Greek a lestes, Lestes, which means a brigand. Either he was one of the warrior brigands who infested Jericho road, the kind of man into whose hands the traveler in the parable fell, or perhaps, even more probable, he was one of the zealots who had sworn to rid Palestine of the Romans, even if it meant a career of murder, robbery, assassination, and crime. Barabbas was no petty criminal. A man of violence he might be, but his violence was the kind which might well have a romance and a glamour about it and make him the popular hero of the crowd and the despair of the law at one and the same time. There is still more an interesting thing about Barabbas. It is actually a second name. There must have been a first name. Just as, for instance, Peter had been Simon Bar-Jonah, Simon the son of Jonah. Now, there are certain ancient Greek manuscripts and certain Syrian and Armenian translations of the New Testament which actually give the name Barabbas as Jesus. That is his first name as Jesus. That is by no means impossible, because in those days Jesus was a common name, being the Greek form of Joshua. If so, the choice of the crowd was even more dramatic, for they were shouting not Jesus the Nazarene, but Jesus Barabbas. The choice of the mob has been eternal choice. Barabbas was the man of force and blood, the man who chose to reach his end by violent means. Jesus was the man of love and of gentleness, whose kingdom was in the hearts of men. It is a tragic fact of history that all through the ages men have chosen the way of Barabbas and refused the way of Jesus. We don't know what exactly happened to Barabbas, but one of the historian, John Oxenham, in one of his books, has an imaginary picture of Barabbas. There is no scientific proof regarding this. It says that at first Barabbas could think of nothing but his freedom, but then he began to look at the man who had died and that he might live. Something about Jesus fascinated him and he followed him out to see the end. As he saw Jesus bearing his cross, one thought burned in his mind. That is, I should have been carrying that cross, not he. He saved me. And as he saw Jesus hanging on Calvary, the only thing of which he could think was, I should have been hanging there, not he. He saved me. It may be so, or it may not be so. Certainly, Barabbas was one of the sinners Jesus died to save. Now, we shall move on to the process of crucifixion, which is being narrated in St. John chapter 19, verses 17 through 22. There was no more terrible death than death by crucifixion. Even the Romans themselves regarded it with a shudder of horror. Cicero declared that it was the most cruel and horrifying death. Tacitus said that it was a despisable death. It was originally a Persian method of execution. It may have been used because to the Persians the earth was sacred and they wished to avoid defiling the earth with the body of an evildoer. So they nailed him to a cross and left him to die there, looking to the vultures and the carrion crows to complete the work. The Carthaginians took over crucifixion from the Persians and the Romans learned it from the Carthaginians. Crucifixion was never used as a method of execution in the homeland, but only in the provinces, and there only in the case of slaves. It was unthinkable that a Roman citizen should die such a death. The routine of crucifixion was always the same. When the case had been heard, the criminal condemned, the judge uttered the fateful sentence, "You will go to the cross." The verdict was carried out there and then. The condemned man was placed in the center of a quaternion, a company of 4 Roman soldiers, and his own cross was placed upon his shoulders. Scourging always preceded crucifixion, and it is to be remembered how terrible scourging was. Often the criminal had to be lashed and guarded along the road to keep him on his feet as he staggered to the place of crucifixion. Before him walked an officer with a placard on which was written the crime for which he was to die and was led through as many streets as possible on the way to execution. There was 2 reasons for that. There was the grim reason that as many as possible should see and take warning from his fate, but there was another merciful reason, that is, the placard was carried before the condemned man and the long route was chosen so that if anyone could still bear witness in his favor, he might come forward and do so. In such a case, the procession was halted and the case retried. In Jerusalem, the place of execution was called the place of a skull, in Aramaic Golgotha. Calvary, we know, is the Latin version of the place of skull. In Aramaic, it is Golgotha. It must have been outside the city walls, For it was not lawful to crucify a man within the boundaries of the city. Where it was, we do not certainly know. More than one reason has been put forward for the strange, grim name, the place of a skull. There is a legend that it was so called because the skull of Adam was buried there. There is another suggestion that it was because it was littered with the skulls of crucified criminals. This is not likely because by Roman law, a criminal must hang upon his cross until he died from hunger and thirst and exposure, a torture which sometimes lasted for days. But by Jewish law, the body must be taken down and buried by nightfall. In Roman law, the criminal's body was not buried but simply thrown away for the vultures and the crows and the dogs to dispose of. But that would have been quite illegal under the Jewish law, and no Jewish place would be littered with skulls. It is much more likely that the place received its name because it was on a hill shaped like a skull. In any event, it was a grim name for a place where grim things were done. So Jesus went out, bruised and bleeding, his flesh torn to ribbons by the scourging, carrying his own cross to the place where he was to die. We will conclude today's session with this. We will continue with the rest of the portion in the next session. Remain blessed. May God bless you all.